you've done a lot of recording prior to getting online. What was the trigger for you that made you think, okay, I want to double down on the YouTube channel? And how did you bring to bear your sort of existing skill set with recording, getting great drum sounds, mixing, mastering, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for asking, because if you ask my wife, I'll talk about it all day. But it was really kind of an uncomfortable position to be in, where as you said, I've done a lot of sessions, I've made a lot of records, and then I started realizing and started, reading in interviews and stuff that things were changing, and guys were talking about in interviews are like, oh yeah, man, the only cats who are really getting sessions these days are guys who have their own room or guys who have their own recording situation. So I could see that. And, paying attention and reading interviews with guys like Kenny Arnoff, Dave Weckl, even Vinny, guys who had, their own recording situations in some way. Greg Bissonette, those guys were really telling me, yeah, man, it's really shifting in that direction. And so I started realizing, man, I've got to really start going in that way. So, I bought a Pro Tools rig, and then I just never found myself wanting to sit down and really figure it out. If I had time, I'd want to be shedding or, listening to records or writing. I love writing lessons and then filming them. So I went through, a couple different Pro Tools rigs, and then just started getting to a point where I started hiring engineers to help me. And then I had a guy helping me with Finale, Nick, Soul Nick. And then one night his band opened up for Galactic at Tipitina's. And afterwards we were hanging out, having a couple of drinks. And I asked him, I said, man, do you do anything with video? I'm looking for a guy who can help me film, help me record. And he was like, yeah, I don't. And then I said, well, let me know if you think of anybody who does. So a couple more drinks in, he was finally like, well, I guess I'd be willing to learn. And so I was like, cool. Because I could tell, he's the kind of guy who, even though he's a great drummer, he's also one of those guys who enjoys being in front of his computer, enjoys recording, enjoys learning about it, enjoys problem solving. So that's an issue that I realized. I just had to realize for myself, there are a lot of guys who are one-man operations and they do a lot of their editing, they do a lot of their recording. But I had to realize for myself, I get very anxious when I'm trying to problem solve or troubleshoot. And I'm sitting there for an hour and a half, going down the Google rabbit hole, watching YouTube videos, trying to learn why my interface is not talking to my computer. I used to just feel like I could be shedding right now. I could be learning new stuff. So I had to bite that bullet and start admitting that about myself and start seeking out people who could do this. Now, especially being in New Orleans, trying to find somebody who can record and film and live stream is really challenging. But I could tell that Nick had the personality to learn and do it. So we started filming. I hired a guy who had a video company here in New Orleans, hired him as my consultant to come in and tell me what cameras to buy. And he was smart enough to be like, are you going to stream? This was probably in 2018. And I said, well, hopefully I will eventually. So he hit me to these Sony cameras that don't turn off after 30 minutes. They don't auto zoom or kind of auto crop when you film in 4K. All these things that I didn't think of, but he helped me get the right cameras. And then we started filming a little bit by ourselves, me and Nick. He started learning about the camera stuff. Jim Toscano was a huge help in helping us consult. And he might be a great guy for you to talk to, because he really has been the go-to guy to help myself, Dave Weckl, Dave Garibaldi learn how to stream. So he consulted us. And when things started locking down as soon as we could start getting in the same room together, I started telling Nick, okay, we're going to start streaming. And he said, well, I don't know how to stream. I said, we're going to learn. So, kudos to Nick for really helping me and being a trooper in being a guy who was willing to learn all this stuff. But I could tell in his personality, because he was my finale guy, and he would help troubleshoot with finale. He knew logic. I could tell he'd be willing to learn, and he was okay sitting in front of the computer troubleshooting. So when building a team, sometimes I have to find people whose personalities work. They may not have that skill fully yet, but I can tell that they have the personality to develop that skill. And that's been fun, but also a challenge trying to seek that out and put all that together and putting together a team.
Yeah. And I think everybody kind of brings their own background to the table. Like the reason why I started out doing everything myself was because I didn't have any gigs and I had a lot of time. And I came up at a time in New York where there were just a bunch of jazz school grads, not that many gigs, and like hardly anybody online yet. So I had endless time to practice, endless time to shoot. And I was desperately looking for some other venue to perform other than just the same clubs where everybody was competing for gigs, where they're like, we only have enough slots to put your band on 3 months from now. Until then, you're out of luck. And I think it would have been silly for me to do anything besides the way I did it. And conversely, you coming up gigging, already having engineers and video consultants in your orbit, having tons of gigs, having a club to manage, as I understand. And it would have been silly for you to spend your time DIYing everything, right?
What was challenging though was to learn that, because I was, watching some of the other guys who were doing the online stuff, and they were very much priding themselves in DIYing it. And then I was in this situation where I realized I had to get on board with the online stuff. I didn't want to be 20 years from now, or 10 years from now, where I'm still in the middle of my career and realizing I missed the boat. I should have started doing this 10 years ago. And I didn't want to be in that position. I didn't want to have things shift so far digitally, which they are in if you, depending on who you ask. But if you're not online in some capacity or another, you're not going to get heard. You're not going to get seen. So I was like, okay, well, I've got to tackle this. But then I realized, yeah, but I'm touring, I'm gigging a lot. I need to start hiring people to help me. And what was really challenging is, convincing my wife that, spending money paying people when I'm not quite making enough money yet, that was a real challenge. But I was like, give me, we can go, depending on how much you want to talk about it, but I had to rebuild everything in 2020. I had to rebuild and start my whole online academy from scratch with a new developer. I just took my content, built a new site with a new developer, hired a great marketing guy, and we can get into that further. My developer is Mary Bradali, and my marketing guy is Steve Burnside. So shout out to them for being my team on that side of things. And then I have my production team. But, rebuilding that and then having to spend on that during COVID when I wasn't making money on gigs either, trying to convince my wife and my new business manager that no, just give me 6 months and I'll make this break even in 6 months. And I was able to do it in 5. So that was a big day of celebration, but that was really scary and really challenging to have been doing it for a while and then decide to rebuild it in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
but I realized if I didn't, it wasn't going to grow. Um, so it was something I had to, for anybody watching this, the reason I'm saying all this is I encourage people to figure out how you have to do it, how it works for your personality, how it works for your life, and how it works for what you're good at, and admitting what you're not, and not being afraid to have people help you if you need to. That's what I had to decide to do.
Yeah, you mentioned we can get into having to rebuild the academy. Was that in response to COVID, or was there some other impetus?
I had a developer, and we had built a site from scratch in a platform that was outdated, that nobody knew how to work on. And we were having to hire freelancers in Switzerland who knew how to work on this platform, and that just wasn't working. So I had to make the tough decision to hire a new team. And the way that I found my people was just talking to people. So my good friend Carl Denson introduced me. Carl's a great saxophone player who now has been playing with the Rolling Stones for a long time now, also played with Lenny Kravitz, and we toured with his band Great Boy All Stars and Carl Denson Tiny Universe for years. So I love Carl, and Carl was asking me about my online stuff, and he's like, man, you've got to talk to Marty Schwartz. So he put me in touch with Marty, and God bless Marty. Marty was willing to talk to me, and he was aware of, my playing and my career as a drummer. So he was willing to talk to me, and he gave me great advice. And then after talking to Marty and getting advice, I asked him, would you mind if I talked to your developer? And he put me in touch with Mary. I started talking to Mary. Mary helped me rebuild my site. And then I asked Mary, do you know anybody who could help me market? She recommended Steve, and Steve markets for Tim Pierce, who's doing really well in the YouTube world, and Rhett Butler and Brett Papa. So with Mary and Steve, I have a fantastic team on the whole development and marketing side. And now one of my students who's been coming to some of my camps, he's been running a video company in Erie, Pennsylvania for 25 years. And he started doing some editing for me. And now, long story short, we film here in New Orleans, and then we send stuff to him and his team. And he's got 4 editing stations in one building. So I send stuff to him, and he delegate. I send stuff to him, and he delegate. I send stuff to him, and he delegates to one of his editors, and we turn stuff around. So I'm kind of getting my system together, but it's taken a minute. So now sometimes I'll bring Stan down. We call him Big Stan because he's 6'9", and I bring Big Stan down, and we'll batch content and film a bunch, and then he'll take it back up to Pennsylvania and edit it for me. So sometimes Nick helps me film here, and sometimes we do my Wednesday night live from here, and Nick is a one-man show, running all the cameras, the streaming, and the audio as well. But then sometimes I bring down a small team, and Stan and Raina will come down and help me film, and then go back and edit it.
Yeah, which brings up something I'm super curious about. Let's take an average week when you're not on tour. It sounds like you've built a really nice team to help you out, probably to save you a ton of time doing the production stuff. But how would you say your time proportions between gigging, shedding, rehearsing, doing your online stuff, producing, et cetera, like within, say, an average week when you're not on tour?
Yeah, that's a great question. So whether I'm on tour or not, I deliberately don't book time in my studio during the weekend. So what I've come to realize is setting up weekly routines really helps make momentum for me. So if usually I'm gigging on the weekends or I'm touring on the weekends, whether I'm out for 3 weeks on a long bus tour, or if I'm doing flyouts for 1 gig or 3 gigs or 5 gigs over a weekend. If I'm not gigging in a weekend, then I spend that time with my wife, my daughter, my family, and I'll have that time off very happily. Now that I'm 51, and when I was in my 20s, if I had time off on a weekend, I would be very anxious. I'm not building my career, I'm not progressing. But now, if I've got that time, I enjoy that time with my wife, my family, my friends. But most often I'm working on the weekends. So what I realized was set up weekly sessions. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, especially Tuesdays. Tuesdays are my big day in the studio. And we usually go in from about 11 a.m. to 5 because Nick is also a gigging drummer. So we try to film a few things on Tuesdays. We start Tuesdays with an 11 a.m. production Zoom, which has Stan and his team in Pennsylvania. Me and Nick are usually in the studio, or we might Zoom from our houses, but we live close to each other. And then I have Dallas, who helps me with social media, and he's in Seattle. So it's 9 a.m. for him, 11 a.m. for us in New Orleans, and noon in Erie, where my videography and editing team is. So we start off Tuesdays with that 1 hour Zoom, and then we start talking about who's working on what and what needs to be turned in when. And then we start filming around noon, me and Nick, and then we'll send stuff off to Stan. I think I froze, so. And then we'll send stuff off to Stan. So I might be filming stuff. I might also be doing sessions. I get a lot of people sending me stuff to record, and I'll do that as well. And then we'll come back in on Wednesdays, and if we need it, we'll go in on Mondays as well. And now, coming up October 9, 10, 11, Big Stan is coming in. He's going to come in on the 8th so we can get all set up. And then we are going to be in the studio from 10 a.m. to 6, 3 days in a row, filming, batching content, lessons, just in the studio. So right now, I might go in the studio. I might be in there till 5 or 6, come home, have dinner with my wife, and then maybe watch a little something together. And then around 8, 8:30, I come into my office and write, because I have to write a lot right now to get ready for this filming session coming up where we're going to batch a bunch of content. So I write, when I first started doing filming, let me start that over. When I first started filming for my drum academy, I would just go in and film, and I didn't write stuff out ahead of time. And that was cool, but then I was starting to try to write out notation based off of what I had just kind of did, stream of consciousness, but I had presented it in clinics and master classes so much I could just do it in front of the camera. But then trying to go back and write it and all that, I found that it was more productive to write it first. And that's what I did when I did my first 2 books. When I did Take It to the Street and Groove Alchemy, I wrote all that first and then filmed it. So now I write first. So I write on planes, I write in the hotel rooms, I write early in the morning before my wife wakes up. I write after we hang at night. I'll come into my office and write a bit. So I've grown to love that process. And then we put it up on a big screen in my studio, and I just reference that. And I don't read it line by line, but just kind of paraphrase. But writing the stuff first really helps organize my thoughts. And it seemed like you reacted to that and you like to do that as well.
Yeah. I went back and forth on it because it's so much more labor intensive. I think maybe the ultimate content comes from having a videographer follow you around and just catching everything off the cuff. And that is supremely labor intensive. You're talking about wading through 6 hours of footage to get a 15-minute video. it's really expensive to pay somebody for their time, et cetera, et cetera. The next best thing to that, in my estimation, is scripting, because especially on this medium where attention is very difficult to capture and very ephemeral, with YouTube, you really want to be catching all the beats. It's like comedic timing. Like if something lags for a second, somebody's going to click away. And when we speak naturally, we have pauses while we're thinking of what to say. We might go back and rephrase, which is one reason why the podcast is so great, because it gives me a chance to do long form and just stretch out and not worry about editing myself so much. But I found if I didn't take the time to script stuff, the videos, there would just be a bigger variance. Like sometimes I'd catch lightning in a bottle, but other times it would just fall flat. And you could tell by the metrics, like a bunch of people were clicking away. So yeah, I was giving you the big thumbs up because I'd arrived at the similar thing. Kind of the optimal way to do it if you don't have 40 hours to make a 15-minute video is scripting, in my opinion.
Right. And then too, I'm sure you look at what performs better, and what I'm learning is that my lesson content performs better than some of the behind the scenes stuff, or some of the, I did a tour of Tipitina's, and, this was during a 3-day run where I had my videographer and, Big Stan and Raina come to town, and I paid to get them to New Orleans, paid for their Airbnb, paid for their time. And then we batched a bunch of content that is going to be great. Me going back to my high school, playing with the high school drum line, doing a tour tips, doing some stuff at gigs and all that. But that stuff isn't performing as well as when just Nick and I film in my studio, and I wrote it all out ahead of time. So guess what I'm starting to spend more time doing is doing the lesson content.
Yep. Yeah, same. And there are certain things that I'll do occasionally just for fun, even though I know they're probably not going to perform well. Like I really love the genre of travel videos and just, vlogs, and incorporating A-roll from interesting places. And that kind of scratches an itch. And maybe 1 out of 10 or 15 videos I've done like that has performed halfway decently. Like maybe the one where I went to Drumeo and the one where I went to Meinl, like both did kind of okay, maybe because even if they don't know me, drummers might find those things intrinsically interesting. For practically everything else, the lesson, and then it's finding a way to like get deep enough inside the concept to satisfy the drummers who are like, literally just give me the lick, but at the same time, like retain the casual people who just want the overview. And that's like a balance you're striking. So it's a whole science.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. And, for me, that was, and still is, a very kind of scary proposition. I think it was February of 2019 when I decided I really need to start building my YouTube channel, because I had a YouTube channel that band management had started for me. And I just kind of thought that, they would build it and all of this. So I realized I'd had it for several years, and I had 470 something subscribers. And that's embarrassing. So I had to start building it. And, the way I started building it was going and finding things that had been filmed, maybe gigs that had been filmed at Tipitina's or gigs that had been filmed at festivals, and taking that and posting it on my YouTube channel. And then I started filming, myself. And at first I started hiring a videographer, Virgil Beddock, who's great. And then I would hire him, and we would do 3 days of filming, and we would batch content. We did that twice, and that garnered my first 27 lessons for my online academy. And I pulled from some of that for YouTube. And then me and Dallas were able to build up the YouTube channel to about 7,000. And then I hired Steve in 2020, and now we're about to hit 30,000. So, Yeah. So, but it's really scary because, you get to a point where I'll be very, if you want, I'll be very candid. You get to a point where you reach these goals in your drumming career. As a kid, you're like, I'm gonna get on the cover of Modern Drummer. I'm gonna win a Modern Drummer's readers poll, right? I want to headline Red Rocks. I want to, headline, our local favorite venue is it's Tipitina's, right? And I want to headline all these festivals, play all these festivals like Coachella and Bonnaroo and so you do all that stuff. And then you realize people's interest is starting to shift. Like I started realizing hanging out with all my endorsing companies, they'd be like, yeah, they talk about, some of our favorite players who we all know and love. And then they'd get a gleam in their eye when they talk about this kid who has 100,000 YouTube followers, or, this kid who's got, just got 1 million views on a video. And so it's like, I started realizing like, and they were also deciding who they were going to give endorsements to based off of their traction online. And I started realizing, man, if I didn't start building that side of my career, I'd be, as we talked about earlier, 10 years, 29 years down the line. And they'd be like, yeah, you made a new record. Great. Where are your YouTube numbers? What is your Instagram following? So I had been focused on Instagram for a while and I was doing okay, but my YouTube was trifling. So now, my goal is to get to 40,000 by the end of the year. And then, but really, to be honest, it's taken a while to get all my ducks in a row with my team and also to get it to where it's breaking even enough to where my wife is not, and my business manager, Lauren and Chloe aren't like, buddy, you're spending more than you're making. So now I'm finally like, I'm doing well. I'm running it like a business. And, shout out to Donald Miller and all of his business teachings. I've been taking a lot of his courses and learning a lot about how to run a business and how to run a team. And that's what I'm doing. And now it's semi-profitable and it's growing. And now I know how to grow it, which is really exciting. So it was scary. Now it's exciting.
That's great. Well, we could talk about this all afternoon. I want to make sure I leave some time to ask you about your kind of core expertise. I had all these questions about New Orleans influences, all this stuff. And in the email you sent me, you wanted to talk about the mixing of styles. So segueing into the style thing, I thought maybe an interesting way into that would be to ask, why does Pie-Eyed Manc sound like it's in Clave?
Okay, that's a great question. And, kudos to you for tackling that tune. And it's a challenging tune. And you did a great job with it. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. So what's really interesting about that tune is Robert Walter and I were working on writing songs for Groove Alchemy, which was my book, DVD, and record under the same title. And I wanted to do a book about classic funk and, yes, how to learn and develop that, but also how to learn from the creative processes of some of those masters and learn what they took from and how they arrived on some of their classic beats and grooves, and then take some of their creative processes and come up with some of my own stuff and then write songs around it. And Robert Walter really helped me with that. So some of the creative processes we could do, like Clyde Stubblefield and Jabo Starks, would take from Clayton Filiaw, Nat Kendrick, and Melvin Parker before them. And they would use things like the upbeat on the and of one and of three, open hi-hat. They both got that from Melvin Parker. Clyde and Jabbo both got that. Then Clyde would take from Clayton Philyaw the displaced backbeat, and he would put the displaced backbeat in things like Cold Sweat and I've got Clayton Philyaw played I Got Money. So things like I Got the Feeling and Mother Popcorn, and Clyde was taken from a couple different drummers and combining those influences to come up with what he was doing. So I was thinking, well, why not combine Clyde and Jabbo and come up with some stuff? But then with Zig, I was like, okay, cool. I've studied and learned so much of Zig's playing and so much of the Meters music. And then Robert Walter came to me with this groove, Pie-Eyed Manc. And I'll be honest with you, when he first started playing it with me, I was like, okay, hold up a minute. Where's the one? And I was completely confounded by that. And then I literally had to say, okay, let me just play a straight beat, and then you play with my straight beat so I can hear where the one is. So I just go, boom, okay. So I said, okay, cool. So I started messing with that. Right. So let's bring it up to tempo a little bit. All right. So I started thinking I was pretty slick, that I had come up with, a Zig influenced beat that Zig hadn't played yet, right? Then we recorded it and all that kind of stuff. Then I started to realize, wait a minute, it's basically just Sissy Strut started on beat 3. So if you take so they're basically the same beat, started in a different place. Now, Sissy Strut is in 3/2 clave.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So then that would conversely, that would put Pie-Eyed Manc in 2/3 clave. Right. So it just kind of took Sissy Strut. I kind of improvised with that concept and formed it to fit with Robert's kind of offbeat organ intro. And then by doing that, I just basically flipped the clave on Sissy Strut. So very cool. Kudos to you on hearing that. And it does sound like it's in clave because it's basically just Sissy Strut started in a different place.
Yeah, it's interesting now that I think about it. When I think about Ziggy's playing, particularly on the bridge to Sissy Strut, it sounds like he's checked out some kind of Afro-Latin or Afro-Caribbean music, right? Like it sounds like a plena. Like it reminds me of this thing from Puerto Rican music that I heard.
Sure, and it's definitely Afro-Caribbean, 1,000,000%. And it's New Orleans. And, what's so interesting about New Orleans is myself and a lot of people consider New Orleans the northernmost part of the Caribbean. And it's a very much more Caribbean feeling city than an American city. When you go to other areas of the country. But, when through the horrific practices of slavery with forced migration of slavery coming from Africa through Brazil, through Cuba, through New Orleans. So once things get to New Orleans, things developed as Afro-Cuban, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And what you get is these African rhythms being played on snare drum and bass drum, European instruments, and through Congo Square being the only place in the United States that allowed African people to practice their culture on Sundays, you have some of the African rhythms kept alive. So clave and ga, you start playing that. That's a 2/3 clave. Start playing that. That starts coming through in the snare drum and bass drum marches.
Yeah.
So, in my opinion, what Zig's playing in the B section of Sissy Strut is a modified version of second line. So boom get boom get get boom. That's second line. So he's playing it. He's playing the second line accents, and he's splitting it up between the snare and the hi-hat, and then coming up. And it's a very New Orleans second line thing. And the A section of Sissy Strut is in 3/2 clave. 3/2 clave. And then the B section switches to a modified 2/3. So it's very Afro-Caribbean, as is most New Orleans drumming.
That's great. And your answer there, gosh, I'm gonna need to clip that, because that was encyclopedic, and it also answered a few other questions that I had on my list to ask you. So that's fantastic. Well, if you're willing, let's segue to how I did on Pie-Eyed Manc. There are definitely some things listening to the take that like I would want to do over on, but I'm kind of doing this thing where I'm just like, get a decent one, send it off. So with your permission, sir, would love your opinion. Tear me to shreds.
Okay. Well, great job. And, hats off to you for tackling that. And even for me, that's not an easy song to play. And it was not an easy song for me to get comfortable with when I tracked it. And we played it live for a while before I did it, before we even tracked it. So comments that I have on your take on it would be, for one, I felt like you could lean back a lot. And, in preparing for talking with you, I've watched a few of your videos, and, one of the things you talked about that I thought was really, something very important to talk about is, what do great drummers have that other drummers don't? And that is the ability to play with themselves and not flam, right? And so I would say apply that concept with the play along, and don't flam with the band. So, and that's at least what I think about, because I've had to play that play along in master classes and clinics and on Drumeo. And, in some situations where, it's being filmed for Drumeo, thousands of drummers are going to watch this. So what I think about when I approach that tune, when I play that tune, is syncing every note and playing every single note with intent and locking every note with Robert Walter, Will Bernard. And that track was played to a click, although the play along doesn't have an audible click in it. So you can rest easy that it's not moving. At times it might lean a little ahead, but it's pretty right down the middle. So I would suggest trying to sit back and lock in with where Robert and Will are, especially Robert, because Robert's got a really good grounded time feel, especially on this track, because we're all playing into a click. So when I play to that, I try to not only focus on locking in with them, but also playing every single note with intent, like my life depends on it. And then also some of the intros, like get a bone gun, get a guy, shake it, a guy going boom, right? So I was thinking some of those you could maybe try locking in with what they're doing, still being creative, but then locking in with what they're doing. I felt like some of what you were doing was contrapuntal, which was cool. And I love some of your hi-hat and snare drum combinations, and you could maybe fit some of that in. So it's funny. I wanted to shed some of that before we talked, but we're like, we got a gun, got gun, like you could fit some of that in with, and I would love to hear that. I would love to hear your take on mixing in some of like the Richard Spaven type, Mark Juliana type things that those guys, combinations that I've heard you do, and then apply it to that. I would love to hear that. That could be super cool.
Yeah. So that's between the eyes. Because listening back to myself, I was like, oh no, I'm way ahead on a lot of this stuff. And yeah, particularly in the intros, like I was just a little bit unsettled. And I think you're exactly right. By sort of just playing verbatim what the other instruments are doing, I could have made it easier for myself. So I think it'd be a fun challenge to like do another take of it, like after hearing what I did and hearing your take on it. I also really appreciate your willingness to be candid, because sometimes my fear when I ask like great drummers their opinion of me playing with their tune is that they're going to be afraid to like dish on it. But I really appreciate your candor on it. And yes, subjectively, another thing I realized with it is like when I don't know the tunes super well, like instead of being in the moment, my brain is like thinking ahead to like, what's the thing I need to catch in 3 bars, in 2 bars? Oh no, I need to start to begin a fill. And once that's ingrained a little more in long-term memory, I feel like it's easier to just stay in the moment and think about it. But I think that's also an experiential thing. Like that's something that makes you great, makes Ziggy great, makes Steve Jordan, Nate Smith, those guys great, is Steve Gadd, is they could be sight reading a tune, but still were able to like divide their attention between reading the chart, anticipating what's coming, but like without the groove moving at all. So that's definitely something I still need to work on.
And I mean, that's something that I still do work on. It's like I'll listen to things. I listen to a live thing where we're not playing to a click, and I'll hear something push, and I'm like, oh man, I need to not push that. So, since we're talking about this tune, like there are sections where it goes and it, really lands on that and of 4. So if I play a big fill leaning into that, I'm not just thinking about syncing that and of the 4. I'm thinking about syncing every note of that fill with the phrasing that Robert's playing with.
Yes. Yes.
So all those little boom. I'm trying to make, if I'm going around the fills, or I'm going around the toms, or if I'm, boom, I'm making sure that all of those eighth notes are locked, are sunk right down the middle. And people talk about playing behind the beat or playing on top of the beat. And for me, in my career, what I usually try to do is play it right down the middle.
Just dead center. Yeah.
What happens is, if you're playing right down the middle to a click, what I've learned since we're on, talking about this, is a lot of instrumentalists who play with their hands, who are playing either organ or guitar or bass, tend to, and this is a generalization, admittedly, but can tend to push forward. And then, there are great musicians that I play with that push forward, like George Porter Jr. on bass. He pushes forward, and he admits it. He's like, yeah, I lean forward. It's cool. But so I'm aware of that. So I play right down the middle, and George can dance on top of me, right? And then Robert plays pretty much down the middle. But if we have a guitar player who might play a little bit on top, those things can sit on top. And what happens is, if you're playing right down the middle as a drummer, when things lay on top of you, you sound like you're playing with a big, fat, laid back pocket, but all you're doing is playing down the middle, and you're giving the illusion, because some people might be playing on top of you, you're giving the illusion that you're playing with this giant, fat pocket, but you don't have to overthink it and pull back and risk dragging, if that makes sense. And then what I've noticed is, when you've got horn sections, people who are breathing using their lungs, horn sections or background vocals, if you stop and you don't keep time on the hi-hat and they're breathing and they're using their lung capacity, again, a generalization, but in general, those groups tend to drag. So if you leave a break and you've got a guitar player or an organ player, they might push. If you've got a group of horns or a group of vocalists, they might pull back. So what do you do in that situation? You just release. Yeah, you just released a lot of pressure. You just released a lot of pressure off yourself by just keep it down the middle. That's all you got to do, in my opinion. Now, unless you're trying to cover a Police tune and you're trying to cop Stuart Copeland, then you definitely want to push, right? And that's okay. And Stuart is one of my favorite drummers of all time. And, if you're trying to cop that, then you want to push, right? And sometimes it's cool to do that. But in general, on a tune like this, Piad Manc, I'm thinking right down the middle.
Yeah. Well, Stanton, this has been amazing. We could go for a whole other hour, but I'll respect your time and wrap it up. Where would you recommend people go first and foremost to check your stuff out?
Well, I am admittedly trying to grow my YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to come check me out over there, if they appreciate your work, hopefully they'll dig some of what I'm doing over there in YouTube. And also Instagram. I'm putting up a lot of fun stuff on Instagram. And, of course, I've got StantonMooreDrumAcademy.com if anybody really wants to dig in to some of my online teachings. But a good place for people to start is the YouTube channel. I'm just trying to play catch up and grow that. And, I'm learning from you and guys like you who have been doing this for a while. So, it's an honor to get the request, to get the invite from you, and I appreciate it. And I've been admiring your work for a while. So thanks for having me.
My pleasure. You're too kind. 1,000 thanks for coming on. It's been awesome. It's been educational. Have a great rest of your day and speak to you soon.